fourth day.
Astronomers typically specialize in different fields. Some will study planets, some will study galaxies. I happen to study stars. Physicists and astronomers have started asking questions about this. They say, why does the universe appear to be designed? I read this book written many years ago called The Anthropic Principle. It's a tome of over 1,000 pages. They draw this interesting story that the world appears to be designed. When they got done, they said it just appears to be designed. There really is no design there. And I'm thinking, well, you look at the evidence and you deny that the evidence is there. How can you not believe that somebody designed all of this?
The secular world says that the Big Bang occurred 14 billion years ago. Everything was compacted into one spot, it expanded, then the stars formed themselves, and then our sun formed, and in the dust around the sun, the earth formed. It was a hot molten blob, got covered by water, and then biological evolution happened. But if that's the case, you've got any number of problems.
According to evolution theory, or atheist evolution theory, the Big Bang created everything, gas clouds went everywhere, and stars contracted from gas clouds out of their gravity. Well, it's impossible for stars to contract out of their gravity, because as soon as you get a gas cloud that compressed, it's going to heat up, and hot gases want to expand, and that expansion force is 100 times or more than the force of gravity. It could never happen. There are all these dog ate my homework stories about how gravity waves from black holes might do a push-pull thing on gas clouds and make this actually happen. But you got a chicken and the egg problem here, because don't black holes come from stars? So you have to get stars in the first place. There are many, many questions in science that have not been answered. But there are many questions that have been answered. So far, it's the problem for the evolutionist of the questions that have been answered, like the coalition of the stars, like violating the first law of thermodynamics, that matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed. The Big Bang insists that happened at least once.
Many people think the universe popped into existence instantly in a Big Bang, and it happened by itself.
Somehow matter has spontaneously come into existence without a prior cause. They have some problems with the laws of nature.
I was speaking to the vice president of the Darwin Coalition once, and I said, well, you all believe in spontaneous generation. He said, we do not. I said, yes, you do. You believe it happened at least once, don't you? Why would a smart person be so easily fogged and fooled by a dumb suggestion that actually his theory does violate the known discoveries and laws of science?
We have two very important concepts in physics called the first and second laws of thermodynamics. The first law says that energy is neither created nor destroyed. And equally as valid as the first law is the second law of thermodynamics, which says things are currently running down, energy is becoming less useful. The useful amount of energy is always decreasing. And we measure this with a thing called entropy. The entropy is always increasing. And it's almost like the world was wound up like a clock and it's been unwinding. The second law would seem to argue that the
universe has not always existed. The material universe has not always existed.
But the first law says you couldn't have a beginning. So we have this contradiction, we have this tension. Both laws are equally true, and yet both laws have extrapolated into the past, contradict one another. Physically, the universe has no natural explanation. It doesn't have a physical explanation.
You see, the other thing they've done in our education system, they said science can only explain things by natural processes.
They've even changed the definition of science from the study of the natural world using the five senses to be the search for natural explanations.
But who decided that? That's an arbitrary definition.
That specifically excludes any possibility of God being involved. God has not only been kicked out, but he's most unwelcome. They've totally changed the methodology of science.
We need to bring the worlds of science and the Bible together for people so they see they mesh. It's the unbelievers that have a problem, not us.
From a secular perspective, they can only get light about halfway across the universe. That's why they have inflation theories and superinflation theories and so on, because they have a problem. They have a light-time travel problem.
You know, the problem is actually worse than we sometimes think. Alpha Centauri is more than 4 light years away. God had to get that light here, not in 4 years, but actually at the end of day 4.
We used to call that the Starlight problem. The nearest galaxy to us is 2 million, 1.5 million light years away. Wouldn't it take 1.5 million years for the light to get here? And yes, in straight space it would. But even the Big Bang theorists will say that space and dimension unfolded.
Some people want to take mentions of in the Old Testament of God stretching out the heavens like a tent or like a canopy, stretching that light miraculously to get here.
He stretches out the heavens as a tent upon a pole to dwell in. He stretches out the heavens as a curtain. He that arched the heavens, he that bowed the heavens. He stretched out the heavens across the north place. All these verses and many more indicate that the way God did it was stretching.
The telescope has been around for hundreds of years and has played an instrumental role in many of our greatest discoveries about the universe. Telescopes, much larger and more advanced than these, were used in the early 1900s to measure what became known as redshift, a form of measurement which provided empirical evidence that space was stretching. This meant that space-time itself could actually be manipulated, as if it were fabric. This understanding would begin to bring answers to some of the biggest mysteries of the universe. But this concept was just a recognition of what the Bible already revealed. In the books of both Isaiah and Job, God said he stretched out the heavens like a curtain, and that he created the heavens and stretched them out. These verses gave us further insight to the dimensionality of space and showed us that the universe has been stretched since the beginning of creation. The implications of this biblical concept have been better understood in modern times. What's equally extraordinary is that the Bible also revealed that the earth was round and that it floated in space, hanging upon nothing. Amazing insights proclaimed at a time when some ancient cultures believed the earth was flat. The Bible has always been and shall ever be validated by real science.
Edmund Hubble is credited with perhaps the greatest discovery, many people think the greatest discovery of astronomy in the 20th century, the idea of what we call the expansion of the universe. And if it's expanding, then you would expect more distant objects to appear to be moving farther away from us. As the universe gets larger, there should be a relationship between distance and that apparent motion between us. And we measure that motion by the redshifts.
Now, according to Albert Einstein, if you actually stretch the fabric of space, you will also essentially necessarily have to stretch the fabric of time. So Andromeda is not just 2 million, 1.5 million light years in spatial displacement over that way, but also it's time stretched. Yes, we're looking at the galaxy of Andromeda as it looked at a previous time, but we're also looking at a galaxy that has experienced more time than we have if we're anywhere closer to the center of the stretching.
William Tift, who back about 40 years ago discovered something interesting in the redshifts of galaxies. The universe consists of concentric shells of galaxies, and we're near the center of that. If we're placed there by God for some reason, that's what you might expect. Astronomers more or less have ignored Tift's work over the years, and yet actually it's staring them in the face. In astronomy, as any other science, I think there are evidences that the world is far younger than many people think. Spiral galaxies would be a good example. They actually spin more rapidly at the center and more slowly out at the edges. Obviously, if this thing spins around several times, it starts smearing out the spiral arms. And as that happens, you would spin it out to the point you'd end up with this amorphous disk. They think these galaxies are at least 10 billion years old. So these things would be entirely smeared out. But in 6,000 years, not much smearing taking place. In billions of years, it's a problem. Thousands of years, not a problem. Comets really do have something to say about the age of the solar system. We can divide comets into two groups, what we call the short period comets and the long period comets. For short period comets, a couple 100,000 years, they're all gone. There shouldn't be any left. Long period comets, well, tens of millions, maybe 100 million years, but they're all gone again. So for billions of years solar system, you have a problem. Thousands of years, not a problem. We understand the sun is powered by nuclear fusion, and that could power the sun for billions of years. As it produces energy like that, it changes its composition inside, and over time, it should slowly brighten. And as it does, the Earth would get warmer. Now, again, over thousands of years, not a problem. But if you go back a couple of billion years, 3 billion years or so, when life first supposedly developed on the planet, you have a problem because the Earth would have been far colder and it would have been frozen, and nobody thinks that that happened. In billions of years, it's a problem. Thousands of years, not a problem.
In fact, other planets in our solar system testify to a young universe as well. Both the density and magnetic field of Mercury cannot allow for millions of years. In 1984, Russell Humphreys correctly calculated the magnetic fields of Uranus and Neptune, several years before the Voyager 2 satellite would measure them. Humphreys used a vital clue from the Bible, that the universe was made only 6,000 years ago. And when the surface of Venus was mapped in the mid-90s, volcanoes, craters, mountains, and other features showed the history of the planet was young. Neptune's too hot to be old. Pluto still has nitrogen in its atmosphere. The rings of Saturn and Neptune aren't uniform, as they would be after millions of years. So do we trust in the timeline of men who are repeatedly wrong and having to change their beliefs? Or do we trust in the Bible, which has never been proven wrong and does not change? And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life." And fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind. And every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth." And the evening and the morning were the fifth day.
And fishes, mga kapatid. Alright. So, medyo bungol po yung audio sound natin. Pero, tinatry na po natin alisin yung tremolong at yung echo. Kasi medyo parang ngungo siya. Medyo hindi clear. Pag nilaksan natin, maingay siya pero mas lalong hindi natin maintindihan. Kaya hindi po natin sinasagad. Pero, andyan na po sila Brother Regine. Sana po maayos natin. At si Brother RJ Alojado daw po ay on the way na. Tricycle. Alright. Okay. Sabi ni Charles Jackson, mga kapatid, gases contract out of their gravity and form stars. So, alam nyo mga kapatid, mayroong dalawang klaseng usok. Magaang usok at mabigat na usok. Alin ang magaan? Yung mainit o yung malamig? Alright. Pag nagkakape tayo, yung usok, pataas, pababa. Pag merong malamig, yelo, ice cream, iced tea, anong freezer, buksan ng freezer sa rep. Anong nangyari sa usok? Pataas, pababa. Pababa kasi mabigat ang malamig at magaan ang mainit. Ngayon, kung gas from Big Bang explosion, from energy mga kapatid, mga nuclear fusion, so mainit yon. So lahat ng gas na mainit, mag-i-expand. Diba? Mag-i-stretch, mag-i-spread. Hindi pwedeng mag-contract into their own gravity at mag-form ng stars. So sabi ng evolution, merong wala, yung wala sumabog, hindi yung mga usok, nag-contract, naging mga tala, naging mga bituin. So imposible yung mangyari yun. Sinasabi nila, nagkaroon ng mga bituin dahil sa black hole. Diba daw yung black hole merong pulling force ng gravity na para makapagbuo daw yung mga bato, magiging mga tala, magiging mga bituin. So, meron problema din doon mga kapatid. Chicken and egg problem. Batusay, ano na una? Manok o itlog? Manok. Saan ang galing yung manok? Ito ang tamang sagot dyan. Sino naglikha sa manok? Ayun. Walakpakan natin si Batusay mga kapatid. So, chicken and egg problem, sasabihin nila, kaya daw nabuo, dyan si Brother RJ, kaya daw nabuo ang mga tala dahil sa black hole, hinigop daw siya. Pero may pagkakamali doon kasi kailangan mo na magkaroon ng star at pag namatay ito after billion of years, magkakaroon ng black hole. So, dapat star muna bago ang black hole. So, hindi pwedeng black hole ang mag-create sa stars. So, ito po ay common problem ng chronological sequence of event sa science. Alam nila to, pero kasi hindi nila to pwedeng i-deny kasi dalawa lang naman pagpipilian. Pag tinanggihan nila yung evolution, other option, creation, ayaw nila yun. Wala namang third option Dalawa lang talaga mga kapatid. So number 2, the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Ito, lahat pinapaniwalaan ng lahat ng tao. The first law of thermodynamics, nagsasabi, matter cannot be created nor destroyed. Only can change its state. Ano yung tatlong uri ng matter? S, solid. L, liquid. Ano yung G? Diba? Palakpakan natin ang bawat isang mga kapatid. Solid, liquid, gas. So, for example, yung water, solid siya. Pag nag-evaporate, magiging gas. Hindi na-destroy yung matter niya. Nag-change lang ng state. Yung gas, cloud, umulan, naging water uli. Yung water, pag tumigas, lumamig, nagiging ice, nagiging solid. Hindi nag-change, hindi nakikreate, hindi na-destroy. For example, yung particle ng house, pag nasunog, magiging particles of smoke. So the particles of the house, of the building, was not destroyed. It still exists. Naging particles of smoke, naging usok lang. Naintindihan natin mga kapatid? Hindi pwedeng malikha kasi walang creator Walang God. Cannot be created, cannot be destroyed. Pero all evolutionists agree, at least once, nangyari ito. Na create ang matter, the whole universe itself, from nothing. Spontaneous generation. So, hindi siya nangyayari kahit kailan, pero at least once nangyari sa Big Bang. Na-create. Nagkaroon ng creation na walang creator, mga kapatid. So, yun ang tinuturo nila. The second law of thermodynamics, lahat ay nag-deteriorate. Diba? Lahat ay naluluma. Mga gamit, wear and tear. Kotse, motor, diba? Nasisira, nabubulok. Ano pa ba? Yung bakal, kinakalawang. Yung kahoy, inaanay. Diba? Ano ba? Yung buhok, nagiging uban. Balat, kumukulubot. Lahat nag-deteriorate. Yung energy nagiging much less useful. So kung ang lahat ng bagay sa buong mundo, mga kapatid, ay pababa ng pababa, pasira ng pasira, papangit ng papangit. So, meron pasimula. Diba? Merong starting point na lahat yan, 100%. Kumbaga sa cellphone, may pasimulang full charge, 100%. Pababa ng pababa yung charge hanggang 0%. Diba? Pero, contradiction ang first law sa second law. Kasi sabi ng second law, pababa ng pababa ang lahat ng bagay, dapat may pasimula. Pero sabi sa first law, walang pasimula because matter cannot be created. You can see the first and second laws of thermodynamics na ina-agree pa ng lahat ng scientists, mga kapatid, sa lahat ng field, merong contradiction in itself at hindi nila masagot. Pero masasagot yan ng Biblia. Kung merong God, merong originator, merong progenitor, mag-create siya, mga kapatid, at lahat yun, pababa ng pababa, patanda ng patanda, lumalabo ang paningin, humihina ang pandinig, humihina ang buto, rheuma arthritis, dahil sa entropy, mga kapatid. Masasagot ang problema pag maniwala lang tayo sa Diyos, mga kapatid. Lahat magsabi, praise the Lord. Number 3, hindi na ako masyadong magtanong, no? Kasi medyo, sana, Brother RJ, request namin na maalis yung tremol, no? Yung trebolong, yung echo, para hindi siya ngongo. Yan. Okay, thank you. The longer something spins, the slower it gets. Pag meron tayong pinaikot, mga kapatid, Brother Jet, pag nagpaikot ka ng trumpo, marunong ka magtrumpo? Ay, hindi. Okay, lilingon sa likod. Wala namang ibang jet maliban sa'yo. So, pag nagpaikot tayo ng trumpo, sa una, mabilis yan, di ba? Habang buhay ba yung umikot ng ganun kabilis? Di ba? Habang tumatagal, pabagal lang pabagal. At pag sobrang bagal na ng force, ng kinetic energy, hihinto siya at matutumba. Kasi lahat ng pasimulang paikutin, pabagal ng pabagal hanggang sa huminto. Ganon din yung Beyblade. O yung coin, yung barya, yung piso. Paikutin niya yung piso sa lamesa, ikot-ikot siya mabilis. Diba? Pabagal ng pabagal. Hindi naman forever siyang umiikot hanggang siya ay matumba. So lahat ng umiikot, pabagal ng pabagal. Mga planeta po umiikot. Yung mga asteroid, mga buwan, mga moons, pati yung araw mismo, at lahat ng stars, pati mga galaxy, spiral galaxies, like dalawa, Milky Way at yung Andromeda. Lahat ito umiikot. Kung billion of years talaga, kasi yun yung title natin, di ba? Billion of years versus 6 days of creation, mga kapatid. Kung totoong billion of years, mga kapatid, dapat ngayon, huminto na lahat ng umiikot. Dapat huminto na yung araw. Dapat nalobat na rin yung araw. Kumbaga sa kandila, naubos na siya. Di ba yung kandila po naubos? Hanggang sa maubos yung candle, mamatay yung apoy. Dapat lahat ng planeta huminto na sa pag-ikot. Di ba? Heavenly bodies of today still spin very fast, proving that the universe is young. It's not old. It's just 6,000 years from Adam sa panahon natin ngayon, at ang creation, 6 days lang. Hindi day 1 billion years, day 2 billion years, day 3 billion years. So yung 6 days, 6 billion years week, hindi po pwede yun, mga kapatid. By the way, pag sinabing isang linggo, 1 week, Monday to Sunday, galing po yan sa Biblia. Number 4, sabi dito, yung gravity ng Mercury malakas pa rin. Kung totoong billion of years, dapat humina na ito. Yung mga rings ng Saturn, dapat pare-pareho na ng itsura at ng kulay. Diba, pag dinrawing natin, iba-iba ng size, iba-iba ng color. Ganun mangyayari kung totoong billion of years. At ang Pluto, naniniwala ba kayo na ang Pluto ay planeta? Diba nabawasan na, hindi na 9-8 na lang. Kasi ang Pluto ay isang planetoid. Dapat kasi ang qualification ng isang planet, dapat mas malaki ka sa iyong buwan. A planet should and must be larger and bigger than the moon. Pero kasi yung Pluto halos kasing laki niya lang o kasing liit niya lang yung kanyang buwan. Yung Pluto at yung moon, halos magkasing laki, konti lang diferensya. So siya ay isang planetoid. Sa ganong klaseng planetoid na maliit, mabilis dapat maubos ang nitrogen, mga kapatid, sa table of periodic table. Pero hanggang ngayon, napakarami pa ring nitrogen sa Pluto. Papatunayan, ang universe ay hindi old. Kasi billion of years, mabilis maubos yan. Babagal na, mahihina na, malulobat na. Bari mo, gamitin mo ang cellphone mo for billion of years. Kung hindi malulobat yan. Ilang araw ba malulobat ang cellphone pag laging ginagamit? 2 days, 3 days, diba? So the universe is young kasi lahat ng planets ay kumbaga full charge pa or 70% mga kapatid. Number 5, ito may tanong ako. Napag-usapan natin 3 weeks ago sa TOA, the one above all. God stretched, expand, and spread the heavens. Sino muli ko? Sister Emma, tawag po yung pangalan. Sino po? Sister Alma. Ilang beses daw po inunat o binatak ng Panginoon ang kalawakan? Ilang beses nakasulat po sa Biblia? At tawag po ibang pangalan. Gante-gante.
Sister, ano?
Sino po?
Ay, pastor. Sister Raquel na lang po.
Sister Raquel. Yan. Ilang beses daw po nasulat sa Biblia that God stretched the heavens, expand, inunat, binatak, Tawag po kayong pangalan. Tawag na po kayong pangalan, Sister Raquel. Paano hindi na pa tayo tumagal? Sister?
Pangalan nito.
Pangalan?
Anong pangalan?
Ano po kulay ng damit?
Sister Dang.
Sister Dang. Yan. Ilang beses pa nakasulat yan? Tawag po yung pangalan, sister.
Sister Lisa po.
Sister Lisa Mitas. Still daw. May nag-still? Wala. Tawag po yung pangalan, Sister Lisa Mitas. May nakakalam ba? Nalungkot naman ako bigla. Alright. Ang hirap pa naman mag-timestamp sa description sa YouTube, di ba? Alright. So, ilang beses? 7? Ilang? Nakasulat? Basahin natin. Yan, 17 times. Nakasulat sa Biblia na God stretch, spread, expand, inunat, binatak, ano pa ba? Inunat, binanat, binatak ng Diyos ang kalangitan. That's Big Bang, the everywhere stretch caused by God. Job, Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah, mga kapatid. Alright. Maraming salamat sa PowerPoint. Praise the Lord. Psalms chapter, may nakaharang kasi, hindi ko mabasa. Chapter 19, verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands. Alright? Verse 2, day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. Verse 3, there is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Verse 4, their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Mga kapatid, ang mga langit, first, second, third heaven, the universe itself, nagdideklara ng kaluwalhatian ng Diyos. At ang mga langit, naghahayag ng gawa ng kanyang kamay, mga kapatid. Araw-araw sila ay may sinasabi. Gabi-gabi nagpapakita sila ng karunungan at kaalaman na tinitelescope ng mga astronomers. Walang salita o lingwahe ang tinig ng mga tala ay hindi marinig. Actually, alam natin, umaawit ang mga tala, di ba? Stars can sing, other topic, other preaching, mga kapatid, with whales. Ang kanilang mga tinig ay umiikot sa buong mundo. Ang kanilang mga sinasabi sa hangganan ng sanlibutan. So, walang excuse, without excuse, dahil alam natin, merong nilikha. So, hindi pwedeng walang naglikha, mga kapatid. Tingin ka lang sa mga katabi mo. Tingin ka sa katabi mo. Di ba makikita mo ang kaluwalhatian ng Diyos? Kasi sabi ni Pastor Larry nung Sunday, we bear the image. Amen ba? Siyempre, pag yung katabi mo, image of God, likeness of God, may glory. Di ba? Mahabang buhok, may kaluwalhatian, walang make-up. Pag nakita mo, mabibless ka. Hindi ka matitisod, mga kapatid, kasi we bear the image of God. Mga kapatid, tayo ang magsasabi ng kaluwalhatian ng Diyos. Pag mayroon titingin sa atin, makakita nila ang kaluwalhatian ng Diyos sa atin, mga kapatid. At hinahabaan ko lang mga sinasabi ko hanggang sa pamalakpak kayo at sa ang mga kalangitan ay yun. Nakakaingal pala magsalita na hanggang sa pumalakpak yung mga tao. Alright. So ituloy natin ang video, mga kapatid. Praise the Lord. Makinig tayo at hoping na wala ng echo, hindi na siya ngongo. Alright. Pakipatay na puli ang ilaw. (9:31). So hindi pa tayo mag-uwian ng 9:31. Alright.
You know, a lot of people will say, well, it just seems so hard to believe the Bible because of all those miracles and everything. Well, the Big Bang's a miracle. Evolution of life would have to be a miracle. And the changing of that life into all the origin of the species all require violations of the laws of science. To believe there's no God, you're going to have to believe in miracles without a miracle maker. To believe that evolution is true, you're going to have to violate some of the main, most important principles and laws of science that have been agreed upon. Not only does the evolutionary atheist worldview violate the first law of thermodynamics, that's against a principle of science, but also Louis Pasteur proved spontaneous generation wasn't true. But all evolutionists, every evolutionist believes in spontaneous generation of life.
This whole evolutionary concept that life came from non-life, it actually violates a law of science. It is one of the only laws in biology. It's called the law of biogenesis. It says that life comes from life, not non-life.
The law of biogenesis that says all life comes from pre-existing life, and yet evolution says that life can come from non-life. Surprise, if you just wait long enough.
But you know what? We see no examples of that today. We can't observe it. We can't repeat it. People just believe it blindly.
Anytime they've done these type of origin of life experiments where they're trying to take a soup, so to speak, of all these different molecules, add a little bit of lightning, and
cook everything together, add a spark, and out comes
hard, you know, they end up with gunk. They have to do a lot of tweaking to end up with
amino acids. That's impressive. Ooh.
It's not even meaningful information as far as DNA is concerned.
Every evolutionary story starts with the Miller-Urey experiment.
The best yields they've ever gotten was 80% L amino acids and 20% D amino acids. That would mean that every fifth amino acid in a protein series would be lethal to all forms of life on our planet. The evolutionists tried to get away from this problem of chirality.
The odds for 250 parts coming together, that is 2 times 10 raised to the 476th power. That is going to be a 2 with 476 zeros following after it. That's the odds for the first cell to come into existence.
The best they've been able to do is the idea that the amino acids assembled themselves on the backs of floating crystals in the ocean. Their schemes and the things they've tried to imagine just don't work.
If you take the cell and you poke a hole in it, you have all the components for the cell and yet no life.
They'll say, well, that's an origin of life issue and I'm not going to deal with that. But you have to deal with it because there's no point in dealing with any of these other things if you cannot even get an organism in the first place.
The problems are exponential. People in the field actually know this, but go with it anyway because, well, after all, the other disciplines of science are where the real proof is. So the geologists think that the real proof is with the paleontologists. The fossil studiers think the geophysicists have the proof. The geophysicists think it's the astrophysicists that have the proof. Everyone gets to the airport and thinks somebody else brought the tickets.
They would never do this in any other area of their life. They're denying the obvious because of their starting point that there is no God.
Well, a lot of people are enticed by this idea because it takes God out of the picture.
Here's another way in which young people are being conned. When they read their textbooks and it's talking about changes in finches' beaks or changes you see in dogs, the word evolution is used. But then the word evolution is also used for molecules to man, so it's a bait and switch.
Just like all the other sequences, like chimps gradually turning into humans, and this little Bambi-looking thing turning into horses, those kinds of things that have been used for evolution really don't belong in the textbooks. Alan Fiducia, the head of biology at UNC Chapel Hill, says that it will be the paleontological embarrassment of the 20th century, the idea that birds evolved from dinosaurs. They're not a related lineage at all.
You know, I get the question of dinosaurs all the time. Consider dragons. You know, we see dragon legends in cultures all over the world. We find petroglyphs, you know, like cave drawings and etchings. And many of these are images of dragons and creatures that we would call dinosaurs today.
The word dinosaur didn't exist until 1841. So before 1841, very often the word dragon would have been used.
Dragon is more of an overarching term. It would include flying reptiles, sea reptiles, as well as things like dinosaurs. Now, when it comes to evidence of dinosaurs and man living at the same time, believe it or not, we actually have an immense amount. When we actually look at ancient histories from various cultures,
we get very detailed descriptions. Those are creatures that today, in our modern world, we would call dinosaurs.
In Genesis, we're told that on day 6, God created the beasts of the earth and everything that creepeth upon the earth. This would, of course, include dinosaurs. In the past, dinosaurs were simply known as dragons. Even as late as the early 1900s, dictionaries described dragons as now rare and a huge serpent. Not only do we find dinosaurs in cave drawings, carvings of figurines, and even in cultural legends from the not-too-distant past, but the Bible speaks descriptively of creatures that sound like dinosaurs. In the book of Job, God tells Job to behold the behemoth, a creature Job would have known. In fact, God specifically says that he made the behemoth along with mankind, and describes it as having a tail that sways like a cedar tree and bones as strong as iron. He's so big that a raging river is nothing to him. The description of this massive creature fits the huge sauropod dinosaurs we know from the fossil record. The Bible describes in great detail a creature that sounds just like a dinosaur, thousands of years before paleontologists would rediscover and rename them.
My daughter came back from her kindergarten class when she was younger. She brought home a book that said that dinosaurs lived 100 million years ago.
That is just an assertion. They're just saying it. They didn't observe this. You can't repeat this. It is man, fallible, imperfect men who separate man from dinosaurs by somewhere in the neighborhood of about 65 million years now. You either start with what God has to say or you start with what man has to say. God, who has always been there, he's perfect, he's infallible. He's the one who says
that people and dinosaurs walked the earth together.
And a lot of people kind of scoff at that, but you know what? You look back in history, nobody scoffed at that until recent times when people started to buy into this concept of millions and billions of years.
One of the things that really helps to convince people of the millions of years is that chart of the geological column, where you see the rock layers, and then you've got the timeline on the side with the millions of years, and then you've got the bottom-dwelling sea creatures, and then fish, and amphibians, and reptiles, and dinosaurs, and birds, and mammals, and people. How did that geological column get developed? It was back in the late 18th and early 19th century. They started to use the fossils, certain fossils called index fossils, to date a rock layer. Oh, well, that rock layer is this old because we know that the rock layers that have those fossils are this old. Well, you might ask, how'd they know how old the fossils were? Good question. They didn't. They were making assumptions about the history of life. That assumption is just invalid.
Remember this? The geologic column. You were probably taught in school that each layer represents a different period of time and was deposited over millions of years. In reality, each layer is simply showing the order of how things were buried. Both land and sea creatures alike are found throughout the geologic column. Sea creatures are found from the lowest to the highest layers, and even on top of mountains. In fact, 75% of the Earth's land surface is made up of sedimentary layers, which are rock layers that are formed in water. Geologists also confess that the world is riddled with massively eroded features, like the Grand Canyon in America, the Blyde River Canyon in South Africa, and the Kapiti Valley in Australia. And yet, they still refuse to acknowledge a worldwide flood. Remember those prophetic verses in Peter? There shall come in the last days scoffers, who are willingly ignorant, that the earth, being overflowed with water, perished. 2,000 years ago, Peter warned us this rejection of truth would happen.
Fossils are actually not the evidence of the history of life, it's the evidence of the death of all life during Noah's flood and how those things got buried. There are sea creatures all the way through the rock record, and we find sea creatures on the tops of all of our highest mountains. There are sea creatures on the tops of the Himalayas, the Alps, the Andes, the Rockies. How'd they get up there? Creatures that don't have any hard parts. Fossil worms, fossil animal manure. That's not going to be fossilized slowly over hundreds or thousands of years. Those are some of the biblical and scientific reasons why we shouldn't accept those millions of years.
Well, a lot of people think the biblical chronology couldn't be true because the Bible says the earth is 6,000 years old.
That's very, very different than saying the earth is 4.5 billion years old.
How do we know it's 4.5 billion years? Because it's only ever stated. It's 4.5 billion years. We know that. Well, how do you know that? Radioactive dating.
You know, a lot of people think that carbon dating proves that the rocks are millions of years old. Carbon dating is never used to date the rocks. It's only used to date former living things.
No evolutionist uses carbon-14 because even if it worked the way they thought it did, it can only go out to 110,000 years max, even using the new accelerator mass spectrometer method.
The half-life of carbon-14 is so short, only 5,730 years. You should not find any carbon-14 in anything older than 100,000 years should have even one atom we could detect. The fact that People are routinely finding significant levels of C14 in all these different fossils indicates something wrong with dating methods.
The half-life, the decay rate of carbon-14 is very short, so it's never used to date the rocks. It's the other methods, uranium changing into lead, potassium into argon, rubidium into strontium, and they have really long half-lives.
All of those, including carbon-14, depend on four basic assumptions. One, you somehow have to be able to estimate the original amount of the parent isotope. Two, you have to somehow calculate the original amount of the daughter isotope. There are little detective forensic ways, but no truly scientific method, rigorous ways to actually determine the beginning of that rock.
They also have to assume that the rate at which, for example, uranium decays into lead has always been constant. But they've only been measuring the decay rates for 100 years.
Pressure, magnetic fields, and heat can change the decay rates. Radioactive lutetium decays 9 trillion times faster in the plasma state, and evolutionists, Big Bang theorists, believe the whole universe began in the plasma state. And one more, you have to assume the sample has been in a closed system the whole time.
Scientists who are well informed on this issue, PhDs in geology and physics, they say there's problems with every one of those assumptions.
And even if one of these assumptions doesn't go their way, then the entire possibility of the whole thing drops to zero.
There's no reason to trust that these are giving us the true age of the rocks.
I'd rather play the lottery with my life savings than bet on something like that.
In 2005, Mary Schweitzer, a paleontologist and evolutionist, made the first popularized discovery of soft tissues in a dinosaur bone, which include blood vessels and cells, DNA, and proteins, all of which decay quickly. Mary Schweitzer herself said, "This flies in the face of everything we understand about how tissues and cells degrade. I can't explain it, to be honest." Mary can't explain it, and neither can her colleagues, who cling to the evolutionary paradigm. To illustrate the problem, let's travel back to the early 1700s. A time when biblical catastrophism was the accepted geological view. If people then found a dinosaur bone, or dragon bone as they may have called it, with soft tissue and remnants of blood still in it, would they be confused? Of course not. They would simply conclude this was a creature that died and was buried during or after the flood, within the past few thousand years. Now let's fast forward to today. Would people be confused to find the same thing in a dinosaur bone? Of course, many people would, because the evidence we find doesn't match the evolutionary timescale we've been conditioned to believe.
Many textbooks say the peppered moth industrial melanism in England is evolution. Well, if that's all evolution is, I believe. The dark-colored peppered moths actually were more camouflaged than the light-colored peppered moths. As a result, the birds could see them and eat them for lunch a lot easier. It's not an evolutionary event at all. It's a natural selection event. Natural selection means to pick or choose, to select from what is already there. Traits that were already there, genetic information that was already there. This process will never get you from copepod sort of things in the ocean turning into moths. It will never get you from monkeys turning into people. This process can't make one step in that. Natural selection may be able to explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest. How did we get moths in the first place is the question evolution claims to answer and can't and doesn't. Instead, they just go look at how the colors shifted. Before the magic of evolution, there were white moths and black moths. After the magic of evolution, there were white moths and black moths. That would happen if Darwin was wrong. It doesn't have anything to do with Darwin's theory.
The types of changes that we're seeing that lead to variation with kinds are not the types of changes that are required by evolution. There is variation within the kind, but not evolution of one kind becoming another kind.
In the creation account, it says that God created according to their kind, after their kind, not through evolutionary processes. You don't have one kind developing into another kind. They're all created according to their kind.
So even though you get variety, they're not changing into other things. You know, bacteria are not changing into more complex creatures.
Yes, you can have great variation within a kind. You can get different species forming, which is what Darwin really saw, but there are limits. There are no mechanisms there at all in genetics to add in new information that never existed to change that into a totally different kind. Dogs always remain dogs. Cats always remain cats. There's nothing in observational science to contradict that.
Every animal will bring forth after its own kind. You can observe that in the existing creation and in the fossil record. Genesis passes the scientific method. Evolution doesn't.
The fact of the matter is the information is stronger than it's been ever. In the past 5 years, there's been a quantum jump in the data, the new discoveries that actually go against evolutionary thinking and make it more and more preposterous, against evolution theory and actually make it untrue. The creationists are finding more and more ammunition in the new scientific data, not theories, in the data, which prompted Eugenie Scott to say, facts are a dime a dozen. Theories are what matter in science. You know what? It's unbelievable what unbelievers have to believe to be unbelievers. Come to me when you can show me the money. Do you have facts or not? Do you have data? Do you have observations? Do you have the scientific method or not? Contrary to what Bill Nye said, we should tell our children what our beliefs are and why. Not just say, this is what you believe, Johnny, but say, here's why we believe this. And it's not just faith. We have science. It's really on our side.